Humans are special, particularly in comparison to other creatures on Earth. This uniqueness largely stems from the intricate and complex nature of the human brain, which is one of the physiological foundations that allows humans to utilize and create tools, thereby commanding all living beings. Unfortunately, regrettable incidents can occur, and if this sophisticated instrument develops some irreconcilable issues, it is like a ship that has lost its direction amidst surging waves, with the individual becoming immersed and lost in the illusory whirlpool of self-consciousness, unable to extricate themselves. The ugliness of human nature is always exposed in criminal cases. Let's explore and study the human nature revealed in these cases together. On November 13, 1990, in the seaside town of Aramoana near Dunedin City on New Zealand's South Island, the sun was shining brightly. The warm sea breeze of early summer blew gently, and the beach outside the town was a playground for children's laughter and play. In the town lived Gary Horton and his two daughters, 11-year-old Jasmine Horton and 9-year-old Quila Horton, along with Gary's girlfriend Julie Bransom and her 11-year-old adopted daughter Rewa Bransom. They all walked home together after school. Of course, the beach was always tempting for the children. The three little girls ran to the seaside and played for a while before bouncing back home under the still dazzling sunlight for dinner. Their father, Gary Horton, had already returned home from work and was busy in the kitchen. Jasmine, waiting for dinner, decided to write a letter to her mother, who had separated from the family, while Quila continued to laugh and play with Rewa. After dinner, Jasmine and Rewa hurriedly pushed their bicycles to the door to play. Quila, who was on dish duty, looked out the window at the setting sun and quickly washed the dishes, but her thoughts had already flown outside. The afterglow of the evening became softer. Jasmine and Rewa were riding their bikes, enjoying the happy time before nightfall on the nearby streets. At this time, there was a problem with the pedal of Jasmine's bicycle, so she and Rewa pushed the bike and found their neighbor David Malcolm Gray, hoping he could help fix it. David Gray, 33 years old, lived in a dilapidated wooden cabin next to the Hortons' home. Gray was a bit of a loner, obsessed with military war books and unable to extricate himself. Due to this fanatical reading hobby, he was somewhat reclusive and rarely communicated with others, but he still agreed to Jasmine's request. He took the two little girls to the front of his house and asked them to wait outside while he went in to get his toolbox to fix the bicycle. Jasmine and Rewa were playing and standing on the street watching Gray busy with the bike repair. Quila was almost done washing the dishes and was eager to go out and join Jasmine and Rewa. At the corner across the street, 41-year-old Jimmy Dixon was playing with his beloved dog in his yard. The Percy family, who had been fishing by the seaside all day and had a great harvest, were now driving back to their home happily against the setting sun. Aramoana at sunset was particularly peaceful and quiet. Just like every ordinary evening in the past, this seaside town began to welcome the arrival of another night. At 7:30 p.m., David Gray finished repairing the bike. Coincidentally, Quila had finished washing the dishes and went out the door, and the three little girls started to hang around on their bikes nearby. At this time, their father, Gary Horton, came out of his yard and walked towards David Gray, and the two started talking. Father Gary didn't like Gray very much and felt uncomfortable with this reclusive man. Maybe he wanted to tell Gray to stay away from his daughters, or maybe for some other reason. But this conversation between the two obviously didn't go very well, so a fierce argument between them immediately broke out. Soon after, David Gray, who was not eloquent in words, left the still chattering Gary Horton and stormed back to his own wooden cabin. David Gray had been in a very bad mental state in the past 6 months. After his father and mother died one after another, he disregarded his sister's retention and moved out of his parents' big house, intending to start a new life in Aramoana alone. However, his reclusive personality seemed to be unable to integrate into the life of the locals, so he continued to indulge in his own world, fanatically reading his favorite military books. Especially some ideas about the future behavior of individual soldiers in combat made him ecstatic. As a result, he had no time to take care of anything else, and then he became unemployed, relying on relief to live. Too many disappointments erupted in this argument with Gary Horton. He suddenly deeply disliked his neighbor Gary Horton. Because of the other party's words, the hostility, and even the indifferent attitude towards his own pets, he was angry as an animal protector. When he walked into his house, his mind filled with anger suddenly captured something. Many noises gathered together in an instant. He almost made up his mind the next second. He told himself it was time. He opened his locker. His eyes began to burn. He carefully stroked the guns placed vertically in the cabinet, feeling the coldness of the gun barrel, but a desire for control rose in Gray's heart. David Gray took out a .22 Remington semi-automatic rifle and calmly mounted a sniper scope. Then he pulled out a box from the bottom of the cabinet and opened it. There were nearly 122 and 223 bullet clips neatly arranged inside. He skillfully loaded the .22 Remington with a clip and carried it on his back. Then he took out a .38 revolver and put it behind his waist. He also chose an AK-47 in .223, loaded it with a clip and hung it on his shoulder. Then he put a dozen clips into a travel backpack and carried it on his back. Finally, he took out a black mask from his wardrobe and put it on his head. Now, he felt that this should be the moment he had been looking forward to. The attire of this moment, the willfulness of the next second, finally determined. David Gray stepped out of the door with the AK-47. Gary Horton was still nearby, staring blankly at Gray pointing the gun at him, and then the gun went off. Gary Horton was hit and turned to run towards his home. Not far away, the three little girls who were still playing were obviously disturbed by the gunshot. When the gunshots began to ring continuously, the three little girls screamed and threw down their bicycles, trying their best to run towards their home. Gray walked along the fence of the house, looking down at the people's panicked behavior. He shot the gun horizontally, driving them into the house like driving animals. 9-year-old Quilla was the last. When she was screaming and the door of her house was already within reach, a bullet hit her. This bullet passed through her left arm and penetrated her chest, and after colliding with the bones in her body, it stayed in the abdominal position. Quilla stumbled and fell, but she immediately got up, turned her head and ran in another direction of the yard. Then she found her father Gary was shot in the back, lying in a pool of blood, and was already dead. Quilla didn't stop at all, climbed over the fence of the yard, and ran wildly to the street. Gray fired a few shots casually and didn't hit Quilla again. But he didn't care at all because he saw Jasmine and Rewa run into the house. He walked into the Horton house without hesitation and started searching for the two children. At this time, David Gray completely forgot that just a few minutes ago, he was still helping the two little girls fix the bicycle pedal. He found 11-year-old Jasmine Horton and Rewa Bransom one by one and shot them to death on the spot. After confirming that there were no more living people in the Horton family, he calmly found the fire source and then patiently lit the curtains on each window. Finally, he walked out of the house with his gun and stood in the open space of the yard, watching the fire in the Horton house gradually spread and listening to the sharp sound of the fire alarm inside the house. 9-year-old Quilla Horton was still running on the street. You have to admit that this is a miracle. A 9-year-old girl who was shot through the left arm and into the chest can still insist on running hundreds of meters. She ran directly to Julie Bransom's house for help. Julie Bransom is the current girlfriend of her father, Gary Horton, and also the adoptive mother of 11-year-old Rewa Bransom. Quilla told Julie that David Gray had shot her father, Gary Horton, to death and intended to kill her. Julie was shocked and quickly called the police. After explaining the emergency, Julie bandaged Quilla's wound with a towel and wanted to take her to the hospital. At this time, she remembered that Jasmine and Rewa were still in the Horton house, and their life and death were unknown. Anxious, Julie carried Quilla, who was already a bit confused, to her own minivan and let her lie in the back seat. Julie got in the car and started preparing to go to the Horton house to search for Jasmine and Rewa, and the Horton house is now on fire. David Gray was standing there admiring his masterpiece when he suddenly saw a minivan coming from across the street. He pulled down his hood expressionlessly, raised the AK-47 and fired directly at the oncoming car. This is Julie's car. She saw the thick smoke of the Horton house and her heart had a bad premonition. When she saw David Gray pulling down his hood and aiming at her from a distance, she instinctively ducked down. Several bullets immediately penetrated the front windshield. The glass fragments left several cuts on her face with a crackling sound. She stepped on the accelerator urgently, and the car quickly passed by where Gray was standing and sped away into the distance. Gray was angry that he didn't stop Julie's car. He carried his gun, running and shooting at the speeding car. But when he chased to the crossroads, his gaze was attracted by a passerby standing at the street corner, stunned. When the fire was raging at the Horton home, Ross Percy's family station wagon just returned to the small town of Aramoana. After a day of fishing with a good harvest, the family was in high spirits in the car. This includes husband Ross Percy, wife Vanessa Percy, their eldest son, 6-year-old Dean Percy, eldest daughter, 4-year-old Stacy Percy. Also in the car was Ross Percy's good friend Alec Tari and Alec's nephew, 6-year-old Leon Wilson. But when they turned the corner, they heard the fire alarm bell ringing in the neighboring street. They also saw a house on a street behind them with a huge fire. In this small town with only 100 or so residents, almost everyone knows each other. So Ross Percy stopped the car by the roadside, and his wife Vanessa Percy was the first to get out of the car to see what was going on. When she was about to run to the crossroads, Julie's car roared past. Then there was a burst of gunfire. She ran to the corner of the street with inertia and confusion and ran into David Gray, who was firing at the receding car. Vanessa Percy saw the man wearing a mask and carrying a rifle, suddenly turning his gaze towards her. She looked at him in disbelief as he approached her and finally screamed in horror, turning and running back. But after only a few steps, she was shot down in the street by Gray. Alec Tari, who was not far behind her and was also getting out of the car ready to help, was stunned by the scene in front of him. But David Gray didn't let him react at all and shot him in the chest several times while running. Gray had already noticed the station wagon parked by the roadside. He jogged closer, completely ignoring the fact that 3 young children were reflected behind the glass of the rear compartment, and fired at the rear compartment of the station wagon crazily. Bullets penetrated the car body, and 6-year-old Dean Percy died on the spot. 6-year-old Leon Wilson was shot in the chest, and 4-year-old Stacy Percy was shot through the abdomen. At the same time, Ross Percy, who rushed at him crazily trying to stop his behavior, was shot through the head by Gray at close range and fell in front of him. After shooting Ross Percy's father, Gray wanted to repeat the strafing of the rear compartment of the station wagon, but found that the magazine was empty. As he stood in the middle of the street changing the magazine, another off-road vehicle with several people on board was coming towards him. So he gave up his original idea, walked towards the oncoming car, changed the magazine, and started shooting at the off-road vehicle indiscriminately. This off-road vehicle was driven by a local resident. He found a fire in the town, picked up several volunteers who were ready to put out the fire along the way, and went to the scene. When he saw someone walking slowly in the distance, shooting, he immediately turned the steering wheel and turned into a nearby side street to evade. Gray found that he didn't hit the target and was about to chase, when he suddenly heard the sharp siren sound coming from the town entrance in the distance. At 7:50 p.m., Julie no longer had any hope for the survival of Jasmine and Rewa. She was just driving mechanically, taking Quilla, who was lying in the back seat, to escape the town and seek medical treatment. Fortunately, they soon met an ambulance on the road that had received an emergency call. The medical staff on the bus began to treat Quilla urgently, followed by fire trucks and police cars. Port Police Chief Star Guthrie, as the first police officer to respond, drove a police car and met with the fire truck on the road before arriving at the small town of Aramoana together. Fire trucks and police cars stopped at the entrance of the town but could not enter. In the town, Gary Horton's residence was already filled with thick smoke, and the continuous gunfire accompanied by the screams of the residents made the scene chaotic. Police Chief Star Guthrie quickly made a judgment and decided with the fire commander Russell Anderson. The police car and fire truck stopped about 250 meters away from the entrance of the town, set up a cordon, and kept a certain distance between the vehicles, sounding the sirens. This can guide the refugees to gather here. At the same time, it can also deter the shooter in the town. At this time, the whole scene, in addition to nearly a dozen firefighters, only had one responding police officer, Chief Starr, and only he was armed. Chief Starr urgently called the Port Police Station and asked for armed police support from the Dunedin, Christchurch, Wellington, and other major cities' police stations. The town had already started to make a fuss. Many residents who learned the truth began to run out of town. The timely sirens gave many people hope. Some people took out their own hunting rifles and escorted some women and children in the town to evacuate to the place where the sirens were heard. David Gray was also a bit panicked when he first heard the sirens. He left the target of the previous off-road vehicle and ran quickly in the opposite direction of the sirens. But he quickly calmed down. He walked on the streets of the small town without any scruples and shot at any moving targets he saw. Soon, Gray found someone looking out from the floor-to-ceiling windows in the yard of the Jameson family. He walked like an ordinary walk through the streets that no longer had any pedestrians. When the person looking out retreated, he pulled the trigger resolutely. The bullets penetrated the glass window in an instant, and several shots hit before the other party found cover. Gray entered the Jameson family's house and found that he had just killed the owner of the house, 69-year-old Tim Jameson. Immediately, he heard a noise coming from the back room. After checking, he found the former mayor of Green Island City, 71-year-old Victor James, who came to visit and immediately shot and killed him and left. At this time, the sun had completely set. The sunset dyed the sky red, and the blood of the victims dyed the town red. David Gray didn't stop at all. After passing through the yard of the Jameson family, he walked along the street to the north of the town. Soon he found another target. At 8:30 p.m., after a simple treatment and examination, the 9-year-old girl who was shot, Quila, was immediately sent to the hospital and finally survived bravely. This 9-year-old girl, because she notified Julie to call the police for the first time, accelerated the arrival of the police and indirectly saved the lives of many people. Later, her heroic performance was awarded the George Medal of the Queen of England. Chief Starr looked at the sky and it began to gradually darken, planning to do something. He collected a shotgun from the evacuated residence and gave it to Fire Chief Russell Anderson as a weapon. After the two discussed and arranged, the chief took out his own gun and sneaked into the town with Anderson to search for possible injured people. When they sneaked to the street near the still-burning Horton house, they heard a low cry from a bullet-riddled station wagon. The two rushed to the car to check. The 3 people lying on the ground near the station wagon were already dead, and they found that there were 3 children lying in a pool of blood in the back seat. One of them was still breathing but in a deep coma, 6-year-old Leon Wilson, and the one crying softly was 4-year-old girl Stacy Percy, who was shot in the abdomen. When Chief Starr gently opened the car door to help, a muffled gunshot suddenly came from the distance. David Gray slowly moved his face from the sniper scope. He hid on the rooftop of a house, watching Jim Dixon lying motionless on the street in the distance. Jim Dixon's mother, Helen Dixon, was hiding in her house with her neighbor Chris Cole. She couldn't persuade her son Jim to chase the dog that was scared away by the gunshot. Because Helen had just had a hip replacement surgery, she couldn't walk normally without help. But when Jim's shouting stopped after a gunshot, his mother Helen could no longer sit still. With the help of her neighbor Chris Cole, she went out to find out. When the two of them hobbled around the corner, they saw Jim Dixon lying on the ground, soaked in blood. In an instant, the muffled gunshot rang out again. 1, 2, 3. Chris Cole was immediately hit by 2 bullets and fell back. Helen, who lost her support, also fell but happened to avoid the following bullets. Helen fell at the corner of the wall. She lay on the ground behind the wall, not moving. David Gray fired 2 more shots and found that the 2 people on the ground were motionless. Because he was confident in his shooting skills, he soon picked up his sniper rifle and started looking for the next target. At the same time, Chief Starr and Fire Chief Anderson were speeding up to carry the unconscious Leon Wilson and the conscious Stacy Percy out of the car. At this moment, the direction where the gunshot just came from suddenly lot of gunfire. The two hastily bandaged the two children and then each picked up one, slowly transferring them to the outskirts of the town in the gradually darkening night. Helen Dixon, the mother, was not dead. As David Gray left, she, who couldn't stand or walk, crawled to Chris Cole's side and found that Chris Cole was also not dead, but was seriously injured. When this mother crawled to her son, Jimmy Dixon, she found that her son was not so fortunate and had already stopped breathing. Unable to move her feet, the tearful mother Helen supported herself on the ground and crawled into her house to call for help. Then she crawled back to Chris Cole to comfort her, saying that help would arrive soon. But soon, Chris Cole's breathing became weaker and weaker. Helen crawled back into the house again to make a second emergency call. The operator advised her to stay inside and told her that, as it was getting dark, the police outside the town knew their location and help would come. Chief Starr and Fire Chief Anderson had by now brought Leon Wilson and Stacy Percy to a safe place outside the town and handed them over to the medical staff. At this time, the first batch of police reinforcements arrived, a detective and two uniformed police officers. Except for the detective, the two uniformed police officers were unarmed. The armed police were still on their way, and Chief Starr felt powerless. He directed several people to take up advantageous positions around the entrance of the town, and during this time, he communicated with the police headquarters and the armed military police commander. Then he was transferred by the rescue center, and someone inside the town urgently needed help. So he asked a detective to use a loudspeaker to call on David Gray in the town to put down his weapon and surrender in order to distract David Gray's attention. He also asked a police officer to take over from Fire Chief Anderson and follow him into the town to rescue Helen Dixon. The two took advantage of the falling night and infiltrated the small town. Because they knew the location of the person in distress, they quickly found Helen Dixon and the critically injured Chris Cole. And what echoed in the town now, in addition to the shouting of the detective outside the town, was the defiant gunfire of David Gray. Chief Starr couldn't determine where David Gray was hiding, nor did he know if there were any other hiders or injured people in the town. After checking the conditions of Helen and the other, he listened patiently to the intermittent gunfire. When he determined that the gunfire was far from their area, he and the police officer carried the two people on their backs and sneaked out of the town. At 9:15 p.m., the critically injured Chris Cole was taken to the nearby hospital on an ambulance. And previously, 6-year-old Leon Wilson and 4-year-old Stacy Percy had already been taken away. Chief Starr was now temporarily in charge of everything on the scene. So far, he knew that 6 people had died and 3 were injured. But how many people were still taking refuge in the town, how many were dead or injured, he had no idea. Chief Starr anxiously reported the current situation to the police headquarters, hoping that the armed reinforcements could arrive as soon as possible. And based on the descriptions of Julie Bransom and Helen Dixon, he determined that David Gray had at least 2 powerful weapons. Even the armed police who rushed to the rescue now may not be able to compare with David Gray's equipment. He requested the police headquarters to dispatch New Zealand's Special Police Forces. At 9:40 p.m., dozens of armed police from Otago and Dunedin, along with an armored vehicle, arrived at the scene. Chief Starr directed the armored vehicle to be parked between the ambulance and the police car to form a barrier against possible long-range sniper fire. Then he climbed to the rooftop of a house at the entrance of the town and began to search for David Gray with binoculars. However, as the night deepened, he was unable to find him. Soon after, Chief Starr received a message from the police radio that the 6-year-old boy Leon Wilson, whom he and Fire Chief Anderson had rescued, was pronounced dead on the way to the hospital. A few dozen minutes later, the assembled armed police slowly advanced into the outskirts of the town, beginning the search for David Gray, survivors, and the injured. However, due to the visibility issues at night and the fear of David Gray's sniper rifle with excellent range and firepower, the entire search process was extremely slow. The inadequate firepower of the armed police made it impossible for them to make deeper progress into the center of the town. Chief Starr was extremely worried. At 0:30 a.m., with the arrival of the armed police reinforcements from Christchurch and Wellington, There were nearly 100 armed police gathered outside the small town of Aramoana. At this time, the police commissioner John Jameson contacted Chief Starr. The police headquarters had authorized the STG to join the operation in the town of Aramoana, but due to the closure of domestic airports, the two special tactical response teams in Auckland and Wellington could not arrive at the scene immediately. The police headquarters were coordinating with the Air Force, but it was likely that the arrival time would be delayed until the local morning. At the same time, Police Commissioner John Jameson told Chief Starr that the police helicopter in Wellington would take off within the next 2 hours and was expected to arrive at the scene around 4 or 5 in the morning to assist in the search for the shooter. At this moment, Chief Starr found that David Gray had not been heard from for nearly 3 hours. The provocative gunfire a few hours ago had also disappeared, and the entire town of Aramoana was shrouded in the dead silence of the night. Chief Starr felt that waiting like this was too long, and perhaps there were survivors in the town waiting for the police to rescue. So he decided to send out some armed police officers, lead the team himself, and search the streets in the center of the town. More than a dozen armed police officers, led by Chief Starr, slowly advanced towards the direction of Gary Horton's burnt home. When they arrived at the location of the previous Percy family's tragic station wagon, Chief Starr asked everyone to disperse and search, staying alert. After the dispersion, Chief Starr was moving forward not far away when a walkie-talkie suddenly rang out of place. The muffled sound of a sniper rifle immediately pierced the night sky again. Stephen Wogan, a police officer who was reinforced from the Wellington police station, was shot in the neck and fell to the ground, bleeding profusely. The dispersed search officers immediately fired back into the night. The entire town was filled with gunfire for a while, but the police could not determine David Gray's specific location, and the counterattack had no effect. Chief Starr ran to the severely injured Stephen and asked the nearby police officers to immediately take him to the outskirts for first aid. David Gray seemed to be a ghost, walking in the dark town. Using the broad view brought by the sniper scope, he occasionally fired at the police from different directions. Chief Starr hid alone in a corner, carefully listening to the unique muffled sound of the sniper rifle, silently identifying the direction of the gunshots. After another gunshot, he suddenly ran towards a house in the dark. David Gray's figure flashed across the yard, running wildly towards a nearby wooden house. Chief Starr fired his gun. Gray fired back hastily while running, and suddenly the magazine was empty. David Gray hurriedly rolled into the shadow behind a sand pile next to a wooden house. Chief Starr aimed his gun at the vague figure behind the sand pile and loudly demanded that David Gray drop his weapon and surrender immediately. David Gray's rifle was out of bullets. Lying behind the sand pile, he couldn't take off the AK-47 on his back, so he didn't move. Chief Scott fired another shot into the air and bellowed for Gray to drop his weapons and surrender immediately. Gray began to plead for mercy. He shouted, "Surrender! Surrender!" as he removed his Remington sniper rifle and AK-47, throwing them out one by one. Then he stood up and slowly walked towards Chief Scott from behind the sand pile. Chief Scott felt that everything was about to end. Holding his gun with one hand and reaching for his handcuffs with the other, David Gray suddenly reached behind his back and pulled out a .38 revolver, firing wildly at Chief Scott at close range. Several bullets penetrated Scott's chest at close range, causing him to collapse. Then, after another gunshot, David Gray disappeared again into the vast night. At 2 a.m., 61-year-old Chris Cole, who was rescued by Chief Starr, was pronounced dead in the hospital due to unsuccessful rescue efforts. As the situation worsened, the armed police who had entered the central area gradually withdrew from the town. Police officer Stephen Wogan, who was shot in the neck, was urgently taken to the hospital. However, Chief Starr still had not returned. The tense atmosphere at the scene became even more condensed. With inferior equipment compared to David Gray and the impact of night vision, police headquarters ordered the armed police on the scene to hold their positions and wait for the arrival of the STG. The police stationed outside the town were in this anxious wait until a ray of dawn appeared on the horizon. As the first light of day began to break, The New Zealand television also arrived above the town of Aramoana, hovering alongside the police helicopter. At this moment, gunfire erupted once again. David Gray, from inside a house, used his sniper rifle to fire at the news helicopter. The helicopter, of course, was not equipped with armored plating and was inevitably hit by the stray bullets, fortunately without causing any casualties. The police helicopter ordered the civilian helicopter to ascend immediately and leave the airspace above Aramoana. At 8:30 a.m., two aircraft from the New Zealand Air Force arrived above Aramoana. One blocked the forest to the north from the air to prevent David Gray from escaping. The other joined the search for survivors in Aramoana and its vicinity. However, the long-awaited STG had still not arrived. The STG teams from Auckland and Wellington were assembled in the early morning, but domestic airports were already closed at that time. So they turned to the New Zealand Air Force for military aircraft assistance. For some unknown reason, the Air Force was unable to provide a ride. Consequently, the STG prepared to take the first civilian flight to Dunedin and then head to Aramoana. As a result, Air New Zealand initially did not allow the rescue team to bring their weapons and equipment onto the plane. After coordination, it was only with the personal presence of Police Commissioner John Banks on the flight that the members of the Auckland STG team were able to proceed to their destination. At the same time, a large number of television stations and press reporters also headed to Dunedin on the same flight. After the noise from the helicopter subsided, David Gray sneaked back to his own wooden cabin. He even made a simple breakfast for himself. After replenishing some ammunition and taking a brief rest in bed at 12:30 p.m., several STGs finally assembled in Dunedin. They quickly made their way to Aramoana by bus. At 1 p.m., the bus carrying the STG members finally arrived at the safety zone outside Aramoana. Local residents who had fled from Aramoana leaned against the scattered vehicles around them, watching the bus slowly pass by with panic and sadness. Some residents even sobbed in the arms of their loved ones. This desolate scene, even many years later, still vividly echoes in the mind of STG Captain Mike Kane. After the bus stopped, the STG members began to check their equipment. Once confirmed, they put on their bulletproof vests, picked up their MP5 submachine guns, and got off the bus. Under the personal command of Police Commissioner John Banks on site, a new search and combat plan was quickly established. The STG team was divided into several smaller units to carry out their designated tasks. After the STG reconnaissance personnel completed the latest terrain survey with the military helicopter, everything was ready. Commissioner John Banks told all the police officers present, "If David Gray is found carrying weapons, shoot immediately without warning." At 1:30 p.m., the helicopter airdropped two STG teams onto the main street in the south of the town. After taking control of the nearby high ground, 3 STG teams began to move towards the center of the town. The armed police began to search each house along the way. As the STG took control of both ends of the street where Ross Percy's station wagon was located, the police began to remove bodies and search for survivors. However, as the search of the houses on both sides of the road gradually unfolded, David Gray remained silent and invisible. At 2:10 p.m., 10 STG members split into 2 teams and entered Mokai St. They approached the ruins of Gary Horton's house, which had already burned out. As they slowly approached David Gray's residence next door, all STG members remained highly vigilant. At 2:24 p.m., the STG was just 30 meters away from the ruins of Gary Gray's house, and the wooden cabin on the right side of the ruins was within 100 meters of visibility. After deploying a sniper on the left side of the street, the armed police continued to search and clear each house nearby. Soon, 4 STG teams completed the control around David Gray's wooden cabin. A flashbang was thrown in from outside the window facing the street. With the sound of the glass shattering, everyone held their guns tightly. Then, after a crisp sound, tear gas canisters were thrown in one after another. 2 STG teams, already wearing gas masks, executed the assault. The door was instantly knocked open. There was no sign of David Gray. After the smoke cleared, STG members found a .22 semi-automatic rifle with a bayonet and a .303 semi-automatic rifle in the open cabinet of David Gray's home. Dozens of magazines and hundreds of bullets were also found at the scene. The assault commander estimated that David Gray must have at least 3 rifles and hundreds of bullets with him, based on the number of bullets and the spacing of the guns in the cabinet. The key is that he is still lurking somewhere in the town and is extremely dangerous. There was also some fresh food left on the dining table, and the scene commander determined that David Gray had not been gone for long. He contacted the helicopters in the air to be on alert in the northern and eastern jungles to prevent David Gray from escaping the town. The always dangerous search operation would continue. At 3:40 p.m., the day seemed to have become particularly long. The police's complete search of the south and west of the town was finally over. The bodies of the victims were sent out of the town one by one. No survivors were found and no David Gray was found. The police began to move east and north. STG Captain Mike Kane's team found a police gun left on the ground while advancing. When his team of 4 continued to move forward for about 20 meters, they found the body of Chief Star Guthrie lying on his back in the shadow behind a sand pile on the side of the street. Captain Mike Kane contacted the armed police in the rear to transport the chief's body. At this time, the walkie-talkie said that another STG team had found a survivor in a house to the north. This STG team found a woman waving to them from the window as they passed by the front garden of a house. And this woman had been hiding under the table in the house for more than 20 hours before being rescued. Captain Mike Kane also excitedly encouraged his team to continue moving east. Perhaps there are other survivors waiting for their rescue. At 4:10 p.m., the helicopter pilot suddenly called on the special channel, and it seemed that David Gray's trace was found in a house in the northeast of the town. The team of Mike Kane, who was searching the houses to the east, responded immediately. He led his team to run to the designated coordinates. This house is located in the northeast of Aramoana. There are huge fences on both sides of the house, which greatly affects the line of sight. The 4 people slowly approached the house, and during this time, Captain Mike Kane asked the team members to be alert and ready to shoot. At this time, Captain Mike found a hole in the wall of the house facing them, but the curtains inside were tightly closed. High vigilance made Captain Mike Kane immediately ask his team to stop and take cover nearby. He hid behind a low wall, took out his binoculars, and quietly observed the windows facing them. Time passed second by second, and everything in the scope of this house seemed to be frozen. Suddenly, the curtain of a window moved slightly, and something flashed behind the window. Even though it was fleeting, Captain Mike Kane still captured it. Although he was not sure, he had a hunch that it was the reflection of the sniper scope. David Gray is likely to be hiding here. He signaled his 3 team members, Rob Baraz, Tim Ashton, and Peter McCarthy, to take their best shooting positions and stand by. Then, he hid behind the low wall and contacted the other STG teams for reinforcements. At 4:45 p.m., the reinforcements quietly entered the house on the left side of the target house and took key positions. At 5 p.m., the house on the right side was searched and occupied by the police. At 5:10 p.m., all the houses in a fan-shaped area in front of the target house were confirmed to be occupied. There was still no movement inside the house, and David Gray seemed to be very patient. Now, the STG members are convinced that Gray is inside, but they cannot lock his target location. Because the nearby environment is an ideal paradise for snipers, STG wants to wait for David Gray to lose patience. Maybe just one shot from him would be enough. The noise in the distance also seemed to stop, leaving only the clatter of the helicopter rotor above. The scene was filled with a strange atmosphere, suffocating. At 5:40 p.m., the sun began to set among the large clouds, and dusk was coming again. As the front assault team leader of STG, Mike Kane could almost hear his own heartbeat. He was asked not to fire blindly first and wait for the sniper to confirm David Gray's location in the house. However, he no longer wanted to wait. Because this is a waste of time, and when night falls, everything will be in favor of David Gray again. After asking for permission, Mike Cain decided to act immediately. He made the tear gas canister collide with the window glass in an instant. With the clear sound of the glass shattering, the yellow curtain behind the window, and even the pattern of the curtain, would forever be accompanied by his memory, repeatedly reappearing in his dreams. The cunning David Gray hid behind the curtain, having already blocked the window with a mattress from inside the room. The tear gas canister bounced back, rolling on the ground after hitting the elastic mattress. Team member Peter McCarthy rushed up to pick up the tear gas canister, took a few steps forward, and tried to throw it again. The muffled sound of a sniper rifle suddenly rang out in the smoke that began to spread after the tear gas canister exploded. Peter McCarthy was hit by 2 bullets in the chest, but was fortunately unharmed due to his bulletproof vest. As David Gray began to shoot, his location was locked in. Several STG teams positioned at a disadvantage simultaneously opened fire. Within just a couple of minutes, the sound of gunfire within the small town intensified. Captain Mike Cain left his cover and ran to the left side of the street, shooting to try to attract David Gray's attention. Team member Rob Baraz took advantage of the visual obstruction by the fence and ran to the bottom of the window, shoving in a stun grenade and the tear gas he was carrying through the gap. The interior of the house immediately filled with smoke. Team members Tim Ashton and Peter McCarthy quickly emerged from cover and approached the front door of the house together, preparing for a frontal assault. The helicopter above illuminated the open area behind the house with a searchlight to prevent David Gray from escaping in that direction. At 5:55 p.m., David Gray responded after a dozen seconds. He broke through a side window, seeking a breakthrough. Carrying a sniper rifle and holding an AK-47, David Gray shouted, "Kill me if you dare," as he ran laterally, firing wildly in all directions. Tim Ashton and Peter McCarthy at the front door immediately fired at David Gray with their MP5 submachine guns. Gray quickly turned his gun, and the three engaged in a close-range exchange of fire while running. Team member Tim Ashton was hit in the ankle by a bullet and fell to the ground, crying out. Peter McCarthy quickly grabbed his collar and dragged him behind the steps. The distance between the two sides was immediately pulled apart. David Gray seemed unstoppable, running and firing indiscriminately through the left fence. Captain Mike Cain immediately fired in the direction of David Gray with his MP5. As David Gray was about to run onto the street, he was hit in the groin by 2 bullets fired from Captain Mike Cain's MP5. David Gray, whose legs instantly lost strength, leaned forward due to inertia. At the same time, a bullet from Captain Mike Cain hit his chest. David Gray was immediately knocked to the ground by the impact of the bullet and could not stand up. But he still fiercely raised his head, lying on his back on the lawn, and continued to shoot around with his gun. Bullets whistling from the distance arrived. One hit his neck, and another entered from his left eye and penetrated through the back of his neck. David Gray finally dropped his AK-47 and clutched his left eye tightly, struggling and howling in pain on the ground. The surrounding STG members all left their cover and slowly approached with their guns. Captain Mike Cain stepped forward, kicked away the AK-47 next to David Gray, and found that he was still alive. He then turned David Gray over, removed the sniper rifle and ammunition backpack he was carrying, handcuffed his hands behind his back, and tightened the plastic handcuffs. After the treatment, Captain Mike Cain called for medical personnel to the scene. When the medical staff arrived, David Gray was still lying on the ground, cursing, and desperately tried to break free from the plastic handcuffs, attempting to make a scene. 2 STG members who responded in time pressed him firmly to the ground and handcuffed him again. Soon, STG members who entered the house where David Gray had just hidden found a .22 Winston semi-automatic rifle with a silencer, an air rifle, and hundreds of .22 caliber bullets left in the house. At this point, David Gray had already lost his previous ferocity and valiance. Although the paramedics began to administer oxygen to him, he seemed to be on his last breath. At 6:30 p.m., Captain Mike Cain reported to the command post outside the town, via the radio walkie-talkie, that the shooter, David Gray, was dead. After a hellish 23 hours, as another evening came, the coastal town of Aramoana finally returned to peace. This tragedy in November 1990 took a total of 13 innocent lives, with 4 others injured. Victims: Riwa Ariki Bryson, 11 years old. Simon Christopher Chris Cole, 62 years old. Victor James Vic Crimp, 71 years old. James Alexander Jim Dixon, 45 years old. Stuart Graham Guthrie, 41 years old. Gary John Holden, 38 years old. Jasmine Amber Holden, 11 years old. Magnus Tim Jameson, 69 years old. Ross James Percy, 42 years old. Vanessa Grace Percy, 26 years old. Dion Raymond Jack Percy, 6 years old. Eleki Talai, 41 years old. Leo Wilson, 6 years old. Injured: Stacy Percy, 4 years old. Chiquita Holden, 9 years old. Stephen Vaughn. Tim Ashton STG. This event had 2 far-reaching impacts. First, it directly led to the revision of New Zealand's gun control regulations in 1992, strengthening the control and restrictions on firearms. Then, ironically, before David Gray's crazy killing spree, the last individual killing incident in New Zealand dates back to 1951, with 5 victims at that time. Under the influence of David Gray's incident, the following 7 consecutive years saw frequent occurrences of individual massacres, including the David Bain family in '94 and Stephen Anderson in '97. There was a sensational killing incident almost every year. After the tragedy of Aramoana came to an end, many police officers who participated in this operation were awarded the Medal of Gallantry. The 3 townspeople, Chiquita Holden, Julie Bransom, and Helen Dixon, were awarded the George Medal of the Queen of England. At the same time, the brave and fallen Port Police Chief Star Guthrie was posthumously honored. He was awarded the George Cross of the Queen of England. However, people lost their relatives, and several families were shattered at the same time. The deep pain will not truly end with the passing of those 23 hours. The 4-year-old survivor, Stacy Percy, became an orphan, and she may never have the innocent childhood that should have belonged to her. The 9-year-old Chiquita Holden also lost all her relatives, and her entire life's memories of childhood will forever be stuck in that endless nightmare. The once peaceful seaside town of Aramoana has now returned to its original state. However, the sadness and pain brought by David Gray on November 13, 1990, have already been deeply imprinted on this land. From then on, it can never be smoothed out as before. Hurting and killing only bring pain, but those with the hyper-aggressive gene only feel excitement. They are the epitome of antisocial personality. If you're interested in my video, please leave a like and subscribe.